What's up, guys? GP here, back with another episode of GP's Library. I should definitely mention at the beginning of this episode, you may be listening to this on a podcast, but I have made this show into a podcast as well. So you can find it on currently at least Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you guys are interested. In this show, I essentially review some books that I've read. I tell you when I read them, I tell you how I read them. So in terms of ebook, audiobook, physical copy, whatever, I give you some of my main takeaways. I give suggestions for who I think the book is for. And then finally, I kind of talk about some walking away points for myself. And that's similar to main takeaways, but my cousin gave me this idea, and it's kind of more about applying what I learned in the book to real life rather than just what I took away. Like, what are some action steps after reading this book? And this is especially what I talk about for nonfiction books. So let's get right into it. So for today's book is May You Never Cry Again by Bernie Mac. I read this as a ebook. And I say ebook because I actually read it when I was working where I had to commute a lot by train. And that was the first time in my life I ever started reading books on my phone, to where I would just scroll on the screen. I actually read books so fast on my phone. It's a pretty small medium. I don't want to stare at a screen all the time, but I will say when it comes to speed and actually like reading the words, not doing like a audiobook or anything like that, I read books so fast. I actually couldn't believe how fast some of the books were over. But ebook, and I also suggested for those of you who are on the go constantly and can't keep up with their phone, or can't always listen to something, like you can really read books on your phone at all times. And I've heard people complain about it, but you'd be surprised how used to reading words you are on your phone. I've met people that are like, I can't read a book on my phone. I'm like, you can read a paragraph text, just put those together and they'll equal a book. But just a suggestion for those of you who don't think you have time to read in transit and Uber, stuff like that, even though I do get kind of car sick while I read sometimes. But regardless, you can always have it, and there will never be an excuse that you don't have a book on you. I read this on March 31st, or I finished reading this on March 31st, 2022. So this is a book that it's been a while since I finished, but I vividly remember this one. I thoroughly enjoyed. This is a memoir of Bernie Mac. At the time of him writing this book, he was in his early 50s. It wasn't that long before he passed away that this book was released. But let me start by getting into my main takeaways of the book. As with most successful people, it takes time to build up that success. And so my first main takeaway from the book is for sure patience. And it's the biggest thing that Bernie Mac probably preached in the book was patience. He was an older man when his success came. The Bernie Mac show was the height of Bernie Mac's success. And he was in his high 40s at that point. He was working at a fast food stand these are the type of details I forget, but I swear it was 10 years. Like a catfish fried food stand here in Chicago, Illinois, before he really got up on stage and got his comedy together. He was so old. He already had kids. And I'm not saying so old isn't like so old, but he was so old compared to what a lot of people think that grinding period is. He was grinding through his 20s, grinding through his 30s, and then finally in his 40s, he started getting some breaks and started making some money and stuff like that. We got to be patient. And we always have to keep our eyes open and our ears open for opportunities. And that's how Bernie Mac eventually kind of clawed his way onto stage, because it took him a long time to respond to his calling. But his calling kept calling. And so he almost had no choice but to end up who he was. This kind of leeways into my next point, which is it doesn't take that long to have an impact. I thought about how long Bernie Mac was famous. It was less than 10 years in terms of nationally famous, big like that. It was a very small sample size. And this is kind of like Patrice O'Neal as well, if people are familiar with Patrice O'Neal. A lot of these guys aren't really huge for that long. The impact doesn't have to be so long when you're as talented as some of these guys. And that's not to say that we don't want to live a long time. That's not to say we don't want to live fruitful lives. But when you're an artist and when you're creating in that moment, be appreciative of that moment and realize the impact that that moment can have on like future generations. People still watch the Bernie Mac show. People still watch Bernie Mac's stand-up. People still watch, if we're talking about Patrice O'Neill's, people still watch his stand-up a lot. People still replay all this stuff on social media. You never know the impact of the words that you're saying or the action that you're making or the art that you create. So say you did only get to make it for a little bit. Say you only got to make it for 2 or 3 years. Say, when I say make it, like your art visible, like people seeing what you create, even as a business owner. Say if you only thrive for 3 to 5 years, it's better than never thriving. I guess that's the point I'm trying to get to. It's better to be there creating, doing what you want to do, and who knows, pass away early or the venture fail or whatever, than to never do it at all. And my last main takeaway is that Bernie Mac succeeded later in life because he was like true to himself. A lot of it, like he hurt himself at the end of the day if he wanted to blow up early, because he was living in Chicago before there was a huge comedy scene in Chicago, or before you could really make it in Chicago. He refused to move to New York. He refused to move to LA. Even as he got movie roles, he would fly out to LA and then fly back to New York. And when he was starting to excel, it was still before this modern day, where that's a little bit easier to do, even though if you want to do comedy or if you want to act and stuff like that, you still need to be in LA and New York City. But regardless, like at the highest level, at the level that Bernie Mac wanted to be at, but still, he stayed himself, and the show was centered in Chicago. He stayed true to himself, and we needed that. Sometimes I think about the fact that like your art, you have to create when it's most relevant. 25-year-old Bernie Mac probably wasn't relevant to us. 35-year-old Bernie Mac still wasn't relevant to us, but like America needed that like uncle, father figure type actor out of Bernie Mac. And so there's a purpose and a reason why he didn't make it until he did. And I think we all need to realize that, or keep reminding ourselves of that, is that if you just keep staying true to yourself, you keep growing, you keep trying, you just have to hope that eventually, through continuing to try, that your art can kind of mesh with the time period that you're in. Because not everybody needs what we need. Like some people connect with the world best 16, and then by 18 they can't connect to the world anymore. Like, is that what you want? Would you prefer that over waiting till you're older? There is no right or wrong answer. Like I said, you just hope that your art hits. But at the same time, the best way to be fruitful and the best way to actually be the best version of ourselves is to be authentically ourselves. And Bernie Mac is a great example of that. He was authentically himself, and it took more time, but he was able to succeed nonetheless. Now I'm going to get into who I think the book is for. So who I think it's for: Bernie Mac fans, obviously. If you followed his career, if you followed his trajectory, if he made you laugh, these stories really reinforce how he got to where he was, and you just understand him better as a person, not so much as a TV dad or a celebrity or anything like that. You really get to see the makings of Bernie Mac. So of course, Bernie Mac fans, comedy fans, if you're an aspiring comic, if you just like comic history, like comedic history, which I do like seeing the backgrounds of history and stuff in comedy and stuff. That's why so many of these books that you're going to see me review or have seen me review are by comedians, because it's just something I truly appreciate. So a comedy fan would really enjoy this, black comedy or just comedy in general. I think it's great. Fans of coming from nothing stories, like he grew up in a very poor family and was very poor actually for a very, very long time. Until his 40s, he had like no money. And so, until like his 40s, he had like no money at all. That's a long time to me. We all dream of having money much earlier than our 40s typically, but we have to be patient. And what no money is, you could really read about poverty. I swear, because I understand middle class to like full success is still coming, technically probably from nothing, some people would say. But some stories, when you truly read about poverty and the poverty that we experience here in America, you realize that there are different levels of coming from nothing. You start to realize, I think, that some people, or for some people, 0 to like $1 million is actually like a blessing. Because most Americans that are in an impoverished situation are really coming from negative to millions, if that's what the goal is. So I think it's important sometimes to read stories to give yourself perspective on who people really are in America and what coming from nothing really means. I talk to some people that I feel like their perspective is just a little bit off when they think of coming from nothing. And of course, if we're just going to talk about race, if you're interested, like with these coming from nothing stories, but like in like a black story in America, like a black story from Chicago, is giving you an example of how somebody could come from a poor neighborhood in Chicago to being at the top of the comedy game. It's a good read for that as well. And next, just for my action steps, just not giving up. I say this, I feel like this is what I get from a lot of these memoirs, but understanding that it takes time to process and become even who we are, and then it takes an additional amount of time to be able to portray who we are through our art, and it takes an additional amount of time for the receiver, the audience, or people out there to understand what you're putting down. And then it takes even more time for them to accept what you're putting down, because they have to understand it, then they have to accept it, and then eventually, if you're lucky, they'll celebrate it. And so there are so many steps to creating, there's so many steps to putting yourself out there. But as long as there's a consistent attempt and a consistent even intention or thought towards what you want to do, I believe that it's possible. So when it comes to people who make it, I read some stories where people have made, very few stories actually, people have had a lot of success in their 20s. I swear, of all the books up here, the only people, there's a lot of books up here, the only people that had real success in their 20s, and monetary success, we could say, would be Steve Jobs on my bookshelf. And like, I have a Seth Rogen book. He was a pretty successful comedian in his 20s. But pretty much everybody else on this bookshelf, their success didn't come until really like mid-30s. And so as I read these stories, as I explore and open up to the reality of what the world is, it keeps me patient. If you've read May You Never Cry Again, feel free to put a comment below. If you just love Bernie Mac, just put a comment below as well. Guys, it's been another episode of GP's Library. Go open a book. I'll see you guys next time.